One of the reasons we are gathered here today is to honor the memory of Harvey Milk. We honor Harvey Milk because he is an example for many LGBT folks and for all of us, really, that it is important to stand up, come out of the closet, and be who you are, not who society and your family of origin have programmed you to be. One of our founding parents, Ralph Waldo Emerson, famously said, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." Emerson and Milk have put their fingers on what I think is our species' greatest problem, the problem of being a self in the face of outside resistance from society and from the very powerful inner resistance exerted by our cultural programming. There's a legend from the 18th and 19th centuries. In the days before embalming, when a person died, or at least looked dead, a string was tied to one of their fingers, which would, after interment, lead through a hole in their coffin up to the surface where it was attached to a small bell. The idea being, if the person was not really dead and regained consciousness, they could wiggle their fingers and set off the bell, alerting a relative or a professional grave watcher to take swift action to exhume the coffin. Thus the saying, "saved by the bell." True or not, it seems to me that this is a pretty good metaphor for the human situation when it comes to being a self. By the time most of us reach our teen years, we are so deeply buried in the convention, tradition, and the narratives of our families and our societies that the actual self we are meant to be, along with a lot of our natural vitality and love for life, is pretty much hidden away and unavailable to us. One may be a bright, accomplished adult with a wonderful spouse, have 2.5 kids who have grown up to be lawyers and doctors, own a house in the suburbs, vacation on one's lake home in Minnesota, have a lot of money in the bank, and spend every Wednesday evening serving at the local soup kitchen, and still not be one's self. In other words, not really living one's life. The situation would actually be pretty hopeless were it not for one thing. There's a string, a metaphorical string, that is attached firmly to the heart, which if pulled can lead to exhumation and new life. What is that string? The string that leads to the new life of authentic being is simply what you love. What you love is there for you, and for most of us in plain sight. The trick is learning to grasp it and start pulling. This is where Emerson comes in. He knew that most of us have a real resistance to pulling on the string of what you love. He also knew that society is not often in favor of one pulling on the what you love string. Additionally, we are rightly afraid that if we start pulling, cultural structures we have built around ourselves and provide us with a sense of safety could come tumbling down. I had a routine in college that I followed every weekday. At 7 a.m., I entered the engineering library. Using the library as a base, I would, when not in class or eating in the dining hall, sit for hours solving engineering problems. At 10 p.m., when the library closed, I would walk back to my room, prepare myself for bed, and read a chapter or two of the Bible and go to sleep. This was all according to plan, my family's plan, that I should be an engineer and be steadfastly religious. It turned out that my what you love string was not attached to engineering. It was connected to religion. It was not, however, a specific religion like the Christianity that I then practiced. My fascination is religion in a general sense, as in how the heck do people use their religion as a vehicle for coping, prevailing, and saving themselves for the greater vivifying life. I found and still find the whole religious project fascinating. I take it as a self-evident truth that it is truly harrowing to be aware of oneself, to be sapient, to everyday snack from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I came to realize that most of us, most of the time, blunt the agony and with it the joy of being by hiding away in the structures of convention, tradition, and narrative, which become our prisons and eventually our graves. Prisons and graves that allow us some feeling of safety, but are, as I said before, structures of our own making that enslave us to approved ways of thinking, perceiving, and imagining. The function of good religion is to allow us to avoid having society metaphorically burn us at the stake, while at the same time come out from behind our prison walls so we can truly be alive to love and to live. Good religion is a vehicle for giving expression to the self. Religion that is not so good buries us deeper in the structures that enslave us. Really bad religion is religion that has been weaponized to attack and belittle those with whom we disagree. And yes, weaponizing their religion is something that you sometimes do too. I have been guilty myself many times. I have become convinced over the years that my ministry, while I travel on my own road of recovery, is mostly about facilitating others in the lifelong task of finding and grabbing hold of their own what you love strings and pulling. This is why I so enjoy all of you taking part in these worship services. When you bring a reading, a poem, a song, a joy or a sorrow to this congregation, you are telling part of your story. When we tell our stories, the prison walls of convention quake, mortar cracks and loosens, foundations shift and give way, and there, hiding in plain sight, is the string of what you love just waiting to be pulled. And now, Terra.
Hello, good morning. I feel like I need to pull a lot of strings now. All right, so Pastor Jim asked me to talk a little bit about shadow selves and selves, and somehow I pulled all of this together, I think. So we'll see how this goes. It may not make sense though, because I just drank a bunch of coffee, so I'm wired. One of my favorite Harvey Milk quotes is actually, hope is being able to see that there is light despite all of the darkness. However, Carl Jung says in Psychology and Alchemy that there is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. And so I thought that today might be a good day to talk a little bit about the shadow self in general, just because I'm delving into a little bit of a deeper dive into this myself, and find it interesting, but also feel like it ties in. So bear with me. Hopefully it makes sense. If not, my bad. I'm imperfect. So if you're wondering what a shadow self is, Carl Jung popularized the idea of the shadow self as parts of your personality that you reject throughout your childhood development. So when we're young, we depend on the adults around us for survival, which creates a deep attachment and need for acceptance. Neuroscientist Tara Swart explains that a child scolded for being outspoken likely wouldn't feel safe speaking their mind from that point on, even as an adult. The message of the person I need won't love me if I do this thing becomes internalized, buried into the subconscious, and therefore can become a trigger for seemingly no reason. Later on, seeing someone who is outspoken or has no challenge speaking their mind could bring up anger or resentment toward those people because they're enacting your shadow traits without any shame or guilt. This leads a lot of us to something called projection. So things that we deny in ourselves that we see in others really distorts our reality, our perception of what's going on around us. So we all have shadows, but we can do work to make ourselves more whole by bringing our unconscious to our conscious awareness. When we're operating at an unconscious level, our shadow effectively controls us. Our shadow traits aren't all bad either. Many people with super low self-esteem put good things about themselves into their shadow. Think of the outspoken person who was told, don't be so loud, don't be so, forceful, don't be so bossy at a young age, keeping quiet. Imagine, a Harvey Milk who was told at a really young age, no one wants to hear your voice, and he stayed quiet. How many Harvey Milks out there were? But just because our personality traits that are in our shadow are hidden from our own conscious awareness doesn't necessarily mean that other people don't see it. One really interesting thing that I just kind of recommend as a side note, or I guess to quote Pastor Jim, by way of footnote, is the concept of Johari Window, which is a really cool tool. There's actually an online version of it where it can help you to understand parts of yourself, things that you identify with, things that you identify with that other people identify with you. But then you can also start to explore some blind spot areas, which is kind of the Johari window equivalent of your shadow. So your unconscious traits, which is a really interesting thing. So where is all of this going, and how do I connect all of these things in with Harvey Milk and all of this? So I started thinking about the shadow self and kind of our shadows in general. And this kind of made me think, oddly enough, of Peter Pan. One of the first scenes in Peter Pan, in at least the kids' movie that I remember, Peter Pan is kind of chasing around his shadow, and he's caught because, the darling children, actually, I think it's Nan, the dog, that catches Peter Pan's shadow. And then they hold the shadow ransom, and force Peter Pan to take them to Neverland because they have his shadow. And there's this really sweet, scene where Wendy sews Peter's shadow back to him to connect him. And I was thinking about kind of this metaphorical shadow, and I'm not entirely sure that, that was the intent behind Peter Pan's shadow. However, when I was looking it up online, just to kind of dig a little bit more, one interpretation is that Peter's shadow is kind of typically understood as a symbol of his inability to reach adulthood. And sorry, distracting kids. And a lot of times I think that when we disconnect ourselves from our shadows or push things into the shadows, it makes us unable to reach ourselves, our whole selves. And if we think about, what that does to kind of our whole selves in general, it leaves us feeling, anger or fear or resentment toward people who can enact their whole selves. I also found it really interesting to think about just the concept of Peter's shadow and closets and hiding pieces of yourself from others. Harvey Milk was a big proponent of coming out and being open about yourself and your identity. But a lot of times if we repress those things, we don't necessarily know that they're there because they're part of our shadow selves. We have to do a lot of digging and a lot of work, which also just makes me so much more in awe of people like, RuPaul and Laverne Cox and Elliot Page, who know who they are and are willing to put that out there for everyone in that bravery, so we can all kind of see that, and see their shadows, I guess, or feel connected to their shadows. So with that, I don't think that there's any actual connection between Peter Pan and the concept of pansexuality, but Pastor Jim told me if it makes me a little bit scared to say, then I'm probably in the right path. So for all of you, out there, part of my shadow is that I identify as pansexual, which is, I guess, not pan Peter Pan, but whatever. We're going to connect it because it's part of my shadow and now it's out in the light. So in honor of Harvey Milk and for tomorrow, in honor of Pansexual and Panromantic Awareness Day, which is actually tomorrow, yay, there you have it. So if you're interested in digging into your own shadow, give yourself grace, and challenge the good parts, because there's always a balance between light and dark, but you can't have one without the other, right? So as Harvey Milk said, if you're not personally free to be yourself in that most important of all human activities, which is the expression of love, then life has lost its meaning. So I will see you all in the shadows.